So yesterday I watched this podcast episode of Diary of a CEO where they had a debate between Gary from Gary's Economics, Gary Stevens I think his name is, and Daniel Priestley, who's a serial entrepreneur in the UK. And the debate was about the right way to tackle the problem with the economy. And Gary, obviously, as usual, promoted his idea of higher taxes on rich people, basically. Whereas Daniel was trying to make the point that economic freedom was what was key, which is actually lowering taxes, reducing the size of government, and allowing people to be entrepreneurial, removing the barriers from them being entrepreneurial, and thereby allowing the economy to grow and create jobs. Now, I think my kind of take on this is, again, a lot of people support Gary because a lot of people are suffering economically, and he's essentially speaking to their problem. And he kept saying this during the debate to both Daniel and Stephen Bartlett, the host of the podcast, saying, you guys aren't getting it, we're all millionaires, we're all going to be fine, but the average person out there can't put food on the table, blah, blah, blah. By the way, this is a point I noticed about Gary. He loves to mention the fact that he's a multimillionaire many, many times, right? I get the sense that it's a bit of a chip on his shoulder. That's my feeling. I'm not a psychologist, but it's a bit weird to hear someone constantly mention the fact that he's a millionaire. Because the other two guys never did this, right? Even though they're also millionaires. But he keeps doing this, and he does this in his book, and he does this in other interviews I've seen with him. And I feel like it's a chip on his shoulder of having come from a working class background. And I think he still feels in a way that it's him versus the elite or something like that. And I suspect being rich is a huge deal for him. And he really wants people to know how rich and successful he is. And this is also why he constantly mentions the fact that he's the best trader in the world, or he was the best trader in the world, and he understood everything. It's just bragging. Basically, it's a guy who is just bragging his way constantly through all of this stuff. And it's kind of irritating, and it's sort of sad, because what I feel is a person who's ultimately insecure about himself. He's insecure about his background and his roots, and that's why he needs to boast about it so that you're impressed by him. That's the first thing I noticed. The second thing was he kept interrupting Daniel. Daniel was trying to make salient points about how things work, how venture capital, how startups work. And Gary would just interrupt him and just questioning him. Like, well, what do you think about this then? Well, what do you think this then? What do you think that
ridiculous, the way, the idea that homes are now worth 10 times the average wage, all of that. The difference is I blame government for that. I blame high taxes because of high taxes, they can take out more debt. They can then inflate the economy.
So do you think if we shrink the government, if we start to slash government spending, do you think that would improve living conditions?
Well, the UK government is 45% of the economy. That's a huge government. It's
so do you think US living conditions
II.
will increase in the next few years because we have a US government now that's planning to slash the US government?
Well, that's what the US voters have asked for.
Do you think it will improve living conditions?
Do I think it'll improve
for the average American?
If there's smaller government? I trust markets.
So you think the average US American will be richer in 3 years than they are now?
Here's what I trust. I trust economic freedom. If people have freedom, they create better decisions for their own life. There's two ways to make decisions, right? There's two ways.
Do you have freedom?
I've got less freedom than I do.
Very disrespectful. I don't think Daniel felt disrespected, but as a viewer watching it, it was quite jarring because I thought, Gary's not here to learn. He's not interested in what Daniel's opinion is. He's not, even though Daniel's talking about things which Gary has no experience with, Gary doesn't care. He just wants to get his point across, and he's convinced that he's correct. Again, a lot of people support him because he's speaking to the problem that the common person is experiencing, and he's offering a solution that sounds so good and so obvious. And in the short term, it's what people think they should do. They think, let's tax the rich. I mean, there's a cultural issue here. In the US, rich people, wealth is celebrated, right? People aspire to wealth. People look up to rich people and think, you know what, I want to get there too. That inspires me. The UK is the opposite. We shun people who have wealth. We demonize them. We stigmatize them. We say, well, if they're wealthy, it must be because the system's unfairly set up for them to succeed, right? It's rigged in their favor, or they were born wealthy. Part of this is because in the old days, the wealthy people were the people who were born wealthy. It was the landowners, it was the gentry. And this idea of someone going from zero to wealthy is relatively recent, actually, in terms of Britain and Britain's history. But overall, it's not a good thing for our national culture to be like this. So we shouldn't be shunning wealth. And Gary's thought, oh, well, we'll just tax the rich people. And Daniel says, okay, well, what happens when they leave? Because everything's digital these days. Some of the richest people are tech entrepreneurs. They can just be anywhere in the world and work remotely and earn their money remotely. Well, and Gary's like, well, we'll just tax their money based on where their customers are. Now, obviously, Daniel says, yeah, but what about profit shifting, right? That's what these companies do. So their customers might be here, but then they say they need to license the IP that they're using for the product from this other company based in a low tax haven. Essentially, they end up avoiding paying tax through all these different techniques and tricks. And then Gary says, well, we'll just stop that practice. And it's just so simplistically naive of him to suggest this. You know, you could stop that practice, actually, but the UK is not going to be the country that's going to be able to do that, because the UK doesn't have the economic heft needed, despite having a large market. We're not the kingpin. It's America, actually. America and possibly China, you could say. So if America was to say, okay, you know what, we're going to stop profit shifting. We want to make sure companies pay their taxes properly. They could probably lead some movement to stop this. If Europe came together to try, maybe, right? The European market as a whole is 500 million people. That's quite big. But overall, everyone knows it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. The world has changed from the 1950s world that Gary seems to sort of always talk about as being some of the best times because taxes are really high in the rich. It's a very different world now. In those days, computer science did not exist. Handheld computers, personal computers, these things didn't even exist. The internet didn't exist, right? A large amount of wealth being created today, the new kind of wealth, is digital wealth. I mean, AI products, for example, right? So it's not the same world as it was before, and Daniel pointed this out very rightly. So you try to stop profit shifting, you try to stop people from being able to move their money around, it's going to be very difficult to do this. Because if you think about it, right, if you have a bunch of countries that are trying to force you to pay tax like this, it would work if those countries were the only options you had in terms of your customer base. But today, companies sell globally, and the global south, right, which is anything outside of the West effectively, is increasing in terms of its economic power, its spending power, and opportunity. So in the future, global companies, it won't be like, oh, most of their customers are in America, Britain, and then a few sprinkled here and there. No, it's going to be much more evenly spread out. So this plan that he has of stopping companies and stopping people from being able to shift their profits around isn't really going to work. It's not going to work. And fundamentally, my point is that, you know, everything he's saying is basically saying, okay, if we just tax the rich people more, right? Rich people already pay a very large amount of tax, 1%. I think the top 10% pay 50% of the tax in this country, the overall tax, 60% actually, yeah. And the top 1% pay 30% of the tax. So they already pay, in terms of the amount of money, they already pay the bulk of tax. The other problem with what he's saying is his entire argument's based on one assumption, which he doesn't even mention, which is tax money is going to be effectively spent. He never even talks about this, right? Do we really trust Rachel Reeves, Ed Miliband, the net zero fanatic? Do we trust these people with more tax revenue? Do you really think these people are going to allocate that money effectively? I don't think so. I doubt most people in Britain think so. But that's what Gary's suggesting. He's saying, well, if we just tax the rich more, then we've got more money for public services. Yeah, but the thing is, Gary, who's going to be choosing how that money's spent? You don't talk about that because you know it's nonsense, right? So taxes themselves don't mean anything. Ultimately, if you think about it, what he's really saying is the government needs more money to spend. So he's advocating for big government. He's advocating for more money to be spent by the government to fix things. We've already got the government spending more money this year compared to last year. They've borrowed money, they've raised taxes. Have things improved? No, they haven't improved yet. Maybe it'll take some time, but the economy is already suffering some shocks. And by the way, they're spending 20 billion plus or whatever on net zero, which is a complete waste of time. To me, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm much more aligned with Daniel's viewpoint that economic freedom is the key. We've got government spending a certain amount of money, fine. But what we need to do is make it easier for people to start businesses. If you want people to get paid more, they need to have jobs that pay them well. If you want those jobs to exist, you need businesses to exist. If you want businesses to exist, you need to have the right incentives in place for people to start and run businesses, for them to be profitable businesses. I would suggest eliminate capital gains tax. It constitutes less than 2% of overall tax revenue. If you got rid of it, it would just make investment into the UK that much more attractive, both domestically and from foreign sources of income. Because now it's not just that you don't have to pay tax on your profits, it's the fact that you don't even have to do the accounting for that. I've had to pay capital gains tax on my investments, and just having to track these things, because I don't know if people are aware of this, but the way capital gains tax in the UK works is that you have to pay the tax, you have to calculate and allocate and pay the tax on every single profitable trade. So if you do anything like stock market shares or anything like that, right? Every time you're trading, you're supposed to be calculating the tax. So it's not just the fact that you're paying tax, it's the fact that you're having to keep track of these things and you have to pay accountants for this if it's really complicated. Just get rid of that. Just get rid of that, right? Get rid of capital gains tax. The most of tax revenue in the country is not from capital gains tax. So that's why I would suggest as an example of something we could do to increase economic freedom for people. So if we do those things, I am confident that the economy will be much better off compared to if we do Gary's suggestion of simply taxing the rich more. The rich people will figure out a way not to have to pay those taxes like they already do. Most of them will just leave. The ones who can leave will leave. The UK is losing millionaires. I think they said in the podcast at a rate of about 1,000 a month or something like that. I don't know if that number's accurate, but I do know overall that the UK is losing wealthy people. These are people who used to pay tax in the UK and they're no longer paying tax because they don't want to pay that tax. So it's a very difficult problem to solve if that's going to be the target for you. So taxing the rich, to me, it's not going to work. And increasing tax on business, well, okay, yeah, you'll get more revenue that way, but you're now disincentivizing business in the first place. I think that people have to get off this idea that a larger government with more expenditure being done by government is a solution to the problem. I was reading this essay not too long ago about the crisis in Britain, about why economically it stagnated. And one of the key reasons that the authors give in this essay is energy prices being too high. Britain doesn't build enough. It can't build as quickly as it used to. It can't build cost effectively. Energy prices are too high. There's a lot of regulation. And one thing they mentioned, which I wasn't even aware of, is the fact that the London Underground, which is publicly owned today, was actually built by private companies back in the day. London Underground was built by private companies. A lot of the railways in Britain were built by private companies. These were not government-funded projects. And yet today, all people want to talk about is how the government can build this, the government can build that. And we don't even try the other way. So, and the national grid as well, the electricity grid was built by private companies before it was put into public ownership. So I just think people need to step back and just think about how we should solve this. Economic freedom, for me, is the right answer. We've had government spending. We've had government try to do things. I think the government is needed for some things, but taxing people more, and I mean people in general, in my mind, is not going to give the economy the boost that people are expecting. And trying to tax rich people more, almost punitively, as Gary's suggesting, because they're rich, they ought to be taxed more, it's just not going to work. It's not going to work. It's not the same times that it was back in World War II when almost all the countries in Europe, right, and America were suffering economically. Everyone had taken a battering. Everyone had taken a battering. It's a very different world today. In that world, yeah, you can put taxes up. Everyone can put taxes up, right? We all need to rebuild. Where are you going to go to if you don't want to live here? You're not going to go to some other place because you can't. Today's world, everything's digital. There are so many places in the world people can go to. There are tax havens that want to bring people in, that want to poach British talent. Plus, not every country is suffering like we are. So there are alternatives that people can go to. So we can't just raise taxes on the rich and expect that we're going to get the tax revenue. By the way, this is another point. If you're raising taxes on the rich, your objective isn't really about the tax rate. It's about making sure there's more tax revenue coming in. And this is another thing. I talked about this in a previous video. Taxes should not be done on the basis of tax justice, because Gary's argument is tax justice. He's not talking about tax revenue. He's talking about tax justice, about how unfair it is. You know, you might be right, Gary. Let's say he's right. At the end of the day, though, what matters is how much tax revenue you're bringing in. So whatever tax rate brings in more tax revenue is what makes sense. And that might not necessarily align with what seems fair. And that's a really, really important point to remember for anyone who's designing a taxation regime. It might seem fair to think, oh, we'll just tax rich people 90%. But are you actually going to get that tax revenue? I would say no, especially in today's world. You're not going to get it. So don't do it. Don't do it. Do a different taxation regime that actually gets in more tax revenue. And actually, if you really want to get in more tax revenue in a sustainable way in the long term, grow the economy. Increase economic freedom, let people build businesses, let people invest, let people keep their profits. And guess what? The economic pie will grow bigger and you will get more tax revenue and you won't need to tax rich people more. You won't need to tax anybody anymore, right? There are countries in the world that are able to do this. Why can't Britain?